Good morning. This is Dolly England, Reproductive Health Access Coordinator with the Reproductive Health Program. And we are really lucky today to be doing an intimate partner violence webinar. This webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to share with others in your clinics if they weren't able to be here today. Yeah, let's get this started. So as some of you might know, we do really fun polling in Dolly's webinars. So we're going to ask you to take out your cell phone, or you can participate via a computer desktop. What you'll need is you'll need to text. Oh, and I have PE46 here, and I apologize. It's going to be RH program to 22333. Caught one of my own mistakes. So it's going to be RH program, not PE46. So it looks like this, kind of when you get it all set up. And I have this first one here for you, and it's, again, the right code that you need to put in. In one word, what county do you represent? So you're going to text RH program to 22333. Again, you're going to text RH program to 22333. Tell us, which county do you represent? Your answers will appear live. Tillamook! All right. Some folks are getting it now. In one word, what county do you represent? Again, you can participate via the web at pollev.com/RH program, or you can text RH program to 22333. Today's webinar will be interactive, and we will have a number of these poll questions. You will want to participate. So I know there's more than one person on this webinar. There's a lot more than one person. So I'm going to give you a second here to tell me in one word, what county do you represent? And you're going to go ahead and text RH program to 22333. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. So I hope you all are ready, because we've got a lot of these polls during today's webinar. Okay, the next question is, I am a RH coordinator, PE46 coordinator, clinical provider, front desk staff, billing staff, enrollment assister, clinic coordinator, or other clinic staff. You're going to text RH program to 22333. And look, that first one, we had a little minute to get situated, and I get it. But now you are all jumping in, and look how fun this is. Okay, so it looks like we've got a few different types of folks on the line right now. Hello to you all. Thank you for participating. We have a number of fun poll questions in today's webinar, so we're going to keep on practicing here. Okay, so we can continue to make sure you get how these polls go. Would you rather live without the internet or live without AC and heating? Would you rather live without the internet or live without AC and heating? And if you want to participate with us, all you have to do is text RH program to 22333 or you can go online and participate via the web at polev.com/RH-program. So it's looking like people would rather have no internet, and I feel like that seems like a reasonable choice, but I'm a princess and I feel like I would want the internet. Oh, choices. Okay, so you all are figuring out my fun poll questions. We've got some more here. Let's move on to the next one, shall we? Okay, another would you rather. Would you rather be feared by all or loved by all? Would you rather be feared by all or loved by all? It looks like people are really feeling the love. I think I'd want to be loved by all too. All right, so these are just to give you a taste of what's to come in today's webinar. You all are tuned in here. If you haven't already, you're going to text RH program to 22333. We have a number of polls today, so you're going to want to participate. All right, so as we get started here, it's my pleasure to introduce to you all Emily Sanjoy. Emily Sanjoy is the Health Programs Coordinator at the Tillamook County Women's Resource Center in Tillamook, Oregon, where she coordinates the community-based advocate and healthcare partnerships. She facilitates provider and advocate trainings to address intimate partner violence and health intersections in Tillamook County and statewide. She was a contributor to the recent release of the Oregon Guide to Healthcare Partnerships and has spoken at several state and national conferences on the experiences and evaluation results of the Tillamook County Safer Futures Project, a project that funded community-based advocates in healthcare settings to reach pregnant and newly parenting women who were victims of intimate partner violence from 2013 to 2017. Her previous work includes domestic violence or survivor advocacy, as well as case management and interpreting in a community health clinic. Emily is a returned Peace Corps volunteer, Healthy Homes, Guatemala, 2008 through 2010. Outside of the office, she's most likely to be found on a yoga mat or in her garden. Please help me welcome Miss Emily Sanjoy. And Emily, you are going to be unmuted in 1 second. Emily.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So let's jump into the workshop agreement, or the next slide. Oh yeah, this is my organization. This is the one I was excited about. These are our learning objectives for today. We're going to be able to name 3 types of reproductive coercion, discuss how intimate partner violence, which I may sometimes slip into referring to as IPV, negatively impacts access to reproductive health services and successful use of reproductive health services, and be able to list 2 strategies for harm reduction in cases where patients accessing reproductive health are also experiencing intimate partner violence. So because domestic and sexual violence are so prevalent, we're going to assume that there are survivors participating on the call today. And because of that, I just want to ask everybody to be aware of your reactions and take care of yourself first. This webinar is being recorded, so do what you need to do to feel safe and comfortable throughout the training. You can stand, stretch, or walk away and take an unscheduled break, because you can come back to this information at any time since it's being recorded. So to talk about intimate partner violence, I think it's important to start with a baseline on what's trauma. It's an experience that's overwhelming for a person, and it might look different for you or me, but it's something that we've all experienced in some form or another. What we know is that trauma is common, and we'll approach today's webinar from a universal framework. Whether it's family violence or something else, the benefit of the universal framework is that it's not an us versus them or a provider versus patient equation or a you versus me even, but this is an all of us issue. Because trauma doesn't leave anybody out, and approaching trauma with a universal approach doesn't shame anyone either. Next slide. So our goal is to recognize that trauma goes beyond the car crash or witnessing violence. It can be cultural, historical, or intergenerational as well. Ideally, as we become more trauma informed, we have an opportunity to examine our own personal beliefs and assumptions about how other kinds of trauma may affect us and how it may affect our patients. So this is a process of connecting our histories with our current selves, bringing an awareness of how values, biases, cultural background, regional perspectives, personal history and beliefs impact our work with patients. And this process of opening up space for emotional and intellectual exploration can lead to positive outcomes with patients. And in terms of intimate partner and sexual violence, I think it's also really important to point out that statistically, we know that marginalized populations are disproportionately impacted by gender-based violence, just as they're disproportionately impacted by other health equity issues. Next slide. So personal exposure to violence and secondary traumatic stress are connected. Author of the book Trauma Stewardship, Laura van der Noot-Lipsky, says, if we're to do our work with suffering people and environments in a sustainable way, we must understand how our work affects us. What all of this means on this slide is that if you've made it through a lot of adversity in your own life up to this point, you may not want to talk about certain subjects with patients. It could also mean the exact opposite, that you feel perfectly comfortable talking about things like intimate partner violence with patients. And all of this means that it could increase your risk for experiencing secondary traumatic stress by bringing up your own personal histories. So be aware of your personal experiences and responses to certain topics with patients, and do what you need to do to take care of yourself so that you can keep going in this work. To today's topic, how many of you have ever been screened for domestic violence or intimate partner violence in the context of a healthcare appointment? Go ahead and text your answer A or B, A for yes, B for no, to the RH program poll. So we have a couple answers coming in, 2 yeses, 1 no's. With the no's, I always wonder if you maybe are a male-bodied individual, and that's potentially why you weren't screened, or if you are female. It's really hard to see in webinar format if you are female and you haven't been screened ever. For those of you who were screened, was it a good experience? Yes is A, B is no. And if you want to type in the chat box, you can talk about why it was a good experience or not. We have somebody who had a good experience. That's always excellent to hear. 2 people who had a good experience. Does anybody want to share in the chat box what made it a good experience? The reason I ask these questions, as we give somebody time to type in if they want to share, is because healthcare has been screening for experiences of intimate partner violence for a couple decades now, primarily within the context of women's health, which is why I commented about when I can't see people, I wonder if the no's are male-bodied individuals or if they're women who have been missed. Particularly in the Affordable Care Act, screening and brief intervention for intimate partner violence was a component of the healthcare changes. It said all women would receive screening and brief intervention for intimate partner violence as part of routine women's health. So no sharing.
We did get one.
Oh, we did.
We did get one. Yep. And it says it was just a screening question on a piece of paper.
Yeah, so that's a really common way to screen for it. And I think that's interesting. I'm not sure if that's being listed as a good experience or a bad experience. I think depending on the person filling out the screening, that could be a good experience, you know, not intimidating because nobody's talking to you. You don't have to share anything face to face. It could also be seen as kind of a negative experience because what if the answer is yes, you have been experiencing intimate partner violence, but no one addresses that question, right? So we'll keep these possibilities in mind.
And it says it was a neutral experience. It was fine,
neutral.
It says.
Okay, neutral. Thank you for sharing, whoever you are out there. Great. So not everybody experienced screening. So let's talk a little bit about addressing barriers to screening. This morning, we hope to address provider barriers by encouraging this universal education approach to talking about intimate partner violence and how it relates to reproductive health, by using a specific safety card intervention. And again, I want to emphasize that it's talking about it rather than just having it on a piece of paper as a screening referral. And we're also going to talk about developing strategies for warm referrals to community-based survivor advocacy programs when patients share relationship concerns. This approach supports staff by guiding you through conversations when you use the safety card, unlike other electronic health record-based screening questions. But before I jump into that, I want to talk a little bit about what is intimate partner violence. I think it's really important that we all have the same definition in mind, because I know based on past trainings that I've done that a lot of times people have very different definitions of what is intimate partner violence. One person in a relationship is using a pattern of methods and tactics to gain and maintain power and control over the other person. Intimate partner violence is a cycle that generally gets more severe over time, and the perpetrator's actions are selective and intentional. It's really important to note that intimate partner violence occurs across all lines of income, race, class, and religion. No community is immune. And here I want to emphasize the last sentence: leaving is not always the best, safest, or most realistic option for survivors. Just practically speaking, I'm sure that most of you on the phone call, if not all of you, are aware of this housing crisis in Oregon, and most of our rural as well as urban areas are experiencing. So there's a practical side to that, as well as a lot of components about violence that mean leaving is not always the best, safest, or most realistic option. So what can we do given that context? We'll keep this question in mind as we move forward in the presentation. It's important to note that most people in abusive relationships don't identify as being in one. And here I want to note that legal definitions are really narrowly defined with a particular focus on physical and sexual assault. But for the purposes of our work, taking into account the public health definition to include a broader range of controlling behaviors that impact health, like emotional abuse, social isolation, stalking, intimidation, and threats, is really critical to successfully talking about healthy and unhealthy relationship dynamics and how they impact health. Expanding personal definitions of intimate partner violence to include these non-physical tactics of abuse is important because your patient's health is impacted by abuse in some cases without ever experiencing physical violence. So non-physical forms of abuse are not a mandatory report. They're not something to be afraid of. They're an important opportunity for you as providers to talk about the health impacts of intimate partner violence. So as I said at the beginning of this slide, most people in abusive relationships often do not identify as being in one. Folks who walk through the door of our advocacy programs, for example, start by saying almost uniformly, I'm really sorry to bother you, and I'm not in an abusive relationship because he's never hit me, but, and then they go from there. So keeping in mind the public health definition is really key to success with talking about intimate partner violence in healthy relationships. Next slide. And I've also heard a lot of people saying like, yeah, this is a problem, but it's not really a problem here. We don't have this issue here. I'm sorry to burst this bubble because it's really disappointing that it's a problem everywhere. And according to the Count Her In 2016 8 That Can't Wait report from the Women's Foundation of Oregon, violence is one of the 8 that can't wait measures for improving the lives of women in the state of Oregon, because an estimated 1 million Oregon women and girls, over half the state's female population, have experienced some form of sexual or domestic violence. So it's definitely an issue in Oregon, an issue in all of our communities, because while the national average is that 1 in 4 women will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime, in the state of Oregon and in Tillamook County, per our research and polls that we've done with research firms in our county, it's 1 in 3 women are experiencing intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, the author of The Body Keeps Score, says that since 2001, far more Americans have died at the hands of their partners or other family members than in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. American women are twice as likely to suffer domestic violence as breast cancer. And let's think about how often we do breast cancer screenings in medical settings, right? And so I'm talking a lot about women and women's experiences. Women are statistically significantly more likely to be victims and suffer health impacts due to reproductive health effects of intimate partner violence, as well as an array of other physical, mental, behavioral health effects due to experiences of intimate partner and sexual violence. Men are victimized as well. The rates are much lower, as low as half the rate of women, and their victimization is often at the other hands of other men. But intimate partner violence and sexual violence is not just an issue for heterosexual individuals. The LGBTQ communities are disproportionately impacted. And these statistics on the screen indicate, intimate partner violence is both public health and a health equity issue. So talking to people across a spectrum of gender orientations and gender identifications and sexual orientations is really important. So can you all poll reasons for why might a person stay in a relationship when domestic violence is happening? I'll use this time to tell you that, go ahead, Dolly.
This is a word cloud, so you should be able to write one word as to why someone might stay in a relationship. Type in the word.
Yes. So I will just use this poll time to tell you that as a disclaimer, we recognize the disparities in people's experiences of experiencing intimate partner violence and the fact that it happens across a spectrum of gender orientations and sexual gender identities and sexual orientations. So much of the research about intimate partner violence really focuses on cisgender heterosexual women, and because we're talking about reproductive health care today, I'll most of the time use she as the survivor or she as the patient and talk about he as a perpetrator, but that is part my habit and part the limitations of our studies, right? So there are people who have children who do not identify as female and give birth to babies, and that's important to note too. Thank you for your participation. Everybody is participating. Reasons for staying, they're dependent on that person. There's trauma involved, and the trauma keeps them sort of trapped in the relationship. Quo, I think that means status quo. There's the quote, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. Fear, status, certainly when you're talking about violence that happens across the spectrum, folks who are well off and highly educated, there's a lot of things that you may lose by leaving that relationship. Financial insecurity is almost always a concern for leaving a relationship where abuse is present, because the person who's been choosing abusive behaviors often chooses financial abuse. So the person who has been enduring that abuse generally doesn't have a lot of access to finances. And I just want to really hone in on the love response. It's really important to note that in spite of the unhealthy tactics and dynamics in the relationship, love can still be very real. So telling a person that they should leave means ignoring our need as humans to love and to be loved. And so it's really tricky, I think, especially for people who don't have a lot of experience working with survivors, to understand that component of the relationship. So we'll talk about some ways to keep the door open with patients who are experiencing intimate partner violence and not shut them down and ignore, all of these challenges to the relationship. Relationship violence has well documented direct health effects. A 1997 study by the US Department of Justice showed that 37% of all women who sought care in hospital emergency rooms for violence-related injuries were injured by a current or former spouse, boyfriend, or girlfriend. In addition to the immediate harm caused by physical injury, ongoing violence and trauma contributes to tremendous health effects over the course of a survivor's life. So women who have experienced domestic violence are 80% more likely to have a stroke, 70% more likely to have heart disease, 60% more likely to have asthma, and 70% more likely to drink heavily than women who have not experienced domestic violence. More than 2/3 of intimate partner violence victims are strangled at least once during the relationship. The average is 5.3 times per victim. And in addition to traumatic brain injury, incidences of strangulation can lead to anoxic injury, which have cumulative long-term impacts depending on the number of times that they've experienced strangulation. Intimate partner violence is a leading cause of homicide for women in the US. And it's really important here to note that psychological abuse alone is an important predictor of health, is as important a predictor of health as physical abuse, and was associated with a number of adverse health outcomes, including disability preventing work, arthritis, chronic pain, and migraines. So as you can see, there's a ton of health impacts for experiencing intimate partner violence. Go ahead to the next slide. I include this list of impacts of sexual violence because many providers only consider physical violence in intimate partner relationships and not sexual violence within relationships. It's important to do both. While sexual assault happens outside of intimate relationships, the majority of survivors of intimate partner violence have experience with sexual coercion, threats, and violence in their relationship, which means they're potentially going to be incurring any of these injuries as well. So why are we talking to you as healthcare providers about talking to your patients in regard to intimate partner violence? Here's why. People trust their providers, and talking to patients about how relationships affect health means that patients are 4 times more likely to use an intervention, such as working with advocates at programs like mine. And folks who are experiencing violence are 2.6 times more likely to exit an abusive relationship. And while leaving an abusive relationship isn't our goal for intervention, because again, we recognize that leaving isn't always the best, safest, or most realistic option. When it is the choice of your patient, because they recognize that the relationship dynamics aren't healthy, that's a fantastic outcome. That's improved self-efficacy. Healthcare providers can be a critical part of the intervention, and community-based survivor advocates in programs like mine can provide a comprehensive intervention. So leaving the relationship isn't the goal, but it can be really positive, and it's super important for people who are not leaving the relationship to have an intervention that can help them plan and do harm reduction work to increase their safety over time. So I showed you some general health statistics. This question is, how does domestic and sexual violence impact reproductive health? Again, a word cloud, and you can text your word to RH program. I'm sure the responses are rolling in. How does intimate partner violence, domestic and sexual violence, impact reproductive health? Pregnancy and trauma are 2 reasons. Pregnancy is getting bigger, more people are aware that that's an issue. Unwanted pregnancy, yes. And I think it's important to include unplanned and unwanted pregnancies because it happens across the spectrum. Not all unplanned pregnancies are unwanted, even in the context of intimate partner violence. Pregnancy can still be a really exciting time for folks, and a time when a person thinks, you know, we're really gonna work together and we're gonna make this work and things will improve. Unfortunately, what we know statistically about intimate partner violence and pregnancy is a lot of times the control tactics, power and control tactics increase. Okay. So, as you noted, intimate partner violence can increase the number of unintended pregnancies. Reproductive coercion involves behaviors aimed to maintain power and control in a relationship related to reproductive health. So reproductive coercion is the umbrella term for what we're going to be talking about today. It's perpetrated by a person who is, was, or wishes to be involved in an intimate or dating relationship with an adult or adolescent. And reproductive coercion includes birth control sabotage, pregnancy pressure, and sexual coercion. We're not going to go to this video right now, but I included a link to a YouTube video from Futures Without Violence called Making the Connections that you can share with your colleagues and check out after the webinar. So let's jump into what are these 3 tactics that I'm talking about specifically. Dolly, can you go ahead and read this quote?
Like the first couple of times, the condom seems to break every time. You know what I mean? And it was just kind of funny. Like the first 6 times the condom broke. 6 condoms, that's kind of rare. I could understand 1, but 6 times. And then after that, when I got on the birth control, he was just like always saying like, you should have my baby. You should have my daughter. You should have my kid.
I don't see a raise hands feature on this webinar, but if there were a raise hands feature, I'd ask you to raise your hand if you don't believe the condom broke 6 times, right? I bet most of you don't believe that. And we know this probably wasn't accidental because let's look at that last line, you know, you should have my baby, you should have my daughter, you should have my kid. Condom manipulation is one form of birth control sabotage. Other forms we've seen and heard from survivors are throwing away pills one day at a time and telling the survivor she was taking them. That's a real story from an individual who experienced an unplanned pregnancy that my colleague worked with. This tactic's also referred to as gaslighting, right? You're throwing, the person choosing abusive behaviors is throwing away the pill, and then the person who's supposed to be taking them says, you know, did I take that? I don't remember taking it. And the person choosing abusive behaviors actively says, oh yeah, you took that already, right? Hiding or destroying pills in any way is a form of birth control sabotage. Removing vaginal rings during foreplay is another thing we've heard about without the survivor's knowledge. Agreeing to pull out and then not pulling out is a really easy way to sabotage someone's birth control. And then more assaultive sabotage are cases of partners pulling out IUDs by the strings. And finally, sabotaging birth control by interfering with birth control access by preventing a woman from making it to her clinic appointment to get the next round of pills, patches, rings. And then there's a wait period oftentimes. You come in and you've passed your time where you're supposed to get your next round. And so you have to take a pregnancy test and you have to wait. So this is really challenging. And studies suggest that up to 17% of women experiencing intimate partner violence also are denied birth control access by the partner who's using power and control tactics. So while healthcare providers sometimes focus on understanding how to properly use condoms, one study found that condom use knowledge isn't enough because women with high STI knowledge who were fearful of abuse were less likely to consistently use condoms than non-fearful women with low STI knowledge. Because it's about abuse, it's not about their inability to understand how to properly use a condom, it's about their inability to control the situation or to have equity in that situation. Next slide. Dolly's gonna read another quote.
He really wanted the baby. He wouldn't let me have, he always said, if I find out you have an abortion, you know what I mean, I'm gonna kill you. And so I really was forced into having my son. I didn't want to. I was 18. I was real scared. I didn't want to have a baby. I just got into college on a full scholarship. I just found out I wanted to go to college and didn't want to have a baby, but I was really scared. I was scared of him.
So pregnancy pressure is the pressure to conceive a child, and it also includes pressuring around the outcome of the pregnancy, whether it's carrying to term or terminating the pregnancy. So remember that intimate partner violence is a pattern of power and control tactics. Pregnancy pressure, birth control sabotage, these are some of the tactics. Another woman shared that her partner had forced her to terminate a pregnancy she wanted to carry to term, and later coerced and threatened her to carry a pregnancy to term that actually endangered her health. Yet another survivor who was using condoms as her primary form of birth control confided in her advocate that her husband, and this is really subtle, would always initiate sex in places like the laundry room, far, far away from the bedside stand where condoms were stored. So these are tactics of pregnancy pressure and coercion.
I'm not going to say he raped me. He didn't use force, but I would be like, no. And then next thing, he pushes me into the bedroom and I'm like, I don't want to do anything. And then we ended up doing it and I was crying like a baby and he still did it. And then after that, he got up, took a shower, and I just stayed there like shocked.
So by Oregon definition in terms of consent, I think most of us would agree that what happened here and the lack of consent and the verbal non-consent to sexual activity does fall under the definition of rape. But the very first thing that this person says is, you know, I'm not going to say he raped me. And this kind of response is really common among women in relationships who sometimes have consensual sex with partners and at other times experience sex like what's described here. So the language we use in clinical encounters need to reflect this being the language of your patients, and it needs to be included in how we talk about intimate partner violence. So it's in the safety cards that we're going to talk about in a bit. Sexual coercion is pressuring a person to go further than they want to sexually. It doesn't always reach this extreme, but it does sometimes. And sometimes this happens in conjunction with threats. So I've heard numerous survivors talk about how they consent to sex to avoid, quote, consequences later. And these consequences can be fights, physical or non-physical. They can be the partner refusing to allow access to finances or to needed transportation. And this is how people who are choosing abusive behaviors pressure and coerce their partners. Next slide. So is this rare among the reproductive health care patient population? Absolutely not. So this random sample of 1,278 women ages 16 to 19 seen at 5 family planning clinics in Northern California found 53%, 1 in 2, more than 1 in 2, experienced intimate partner violence at the time that they were seeking services. We also replicated a similar study at our partner clinic in Tillamook, Oregon, and found 53.3% of the 62 survey respondents experience some form of intimate partner violence. And our partner clinic is a Title X reproductive health clinic and FQHC. So we are not different. This is us. We are them. They are us, right? And it's so important to understand that adolescent girls in physically abusive relationships are 3.5 times more likely to become pregnant than non-abused girls who are sexually active. So this isn't something the average American thinks about or isn't part of our national dialogue on talking about teen pregnancy prevention. I had never heard this working in a clinic. I didn't actually hear this about adolescent pregnancy and teen dating violence until I was working at a survivor advocacy center. So all ages of reproductive healthcare patients need to hear about relationship health as part of preventing intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And here's a red flag. Abused women are more likely to have used emergency contraception when compared to non-abused women. The women in this study experiencing intimate partner violence were more likely to have to use after the fact emergency contraception either in the past or to prevent a current pregnancy. And that makes sense now, given what we know on the previous slides about how people's access is compromised and how successful use is compromised based on sabotage. Okay. Within marriage, the odds of experiencing interference with attempts to avoid pregnancy was 2.4 times higher than among women disclosing a history of physical violence by their husbands compared to non-abused women. So it's important that providers screen all women who come to their practice, not those who are unmarried, but all of them, and even women who may already have a child or children with their husband. Next slide. You can see that intimate partner violence negatively affects access and use of reproductive healthcare services as it increases risk for unwanted pregnancies, increased risk for rapid repeat pregnancies, and increased risk for STIs among birth outcomes as well. So this is a question I get every time that I talk about intimate partner violence. Yes, men can experience reproductive coercion, and there are gender differences about the impact of this on men and women's lives. A female partner could lie about contraceptive use and he could become a father as a result. And this is an unhealthy relationship dynamic that we do not condone. But a question to consider is, were there threats of harm? To date, there haven't been any studies indicating men have become fathers when they didn't want to be because she threatened to kill him if he didn't get her pregnant. Conversely, we do know that countless women have experienced that in their relationships. So what if we challenge the limits of a disclosure-driven practice? Universal education that I'm going to talk about provides an opportunity for clients to make the connection between violence, health problems, and risk behaviors. So I want to introduce this screening tool developed by Futures Without Violence. This tool is the tool that we use. It's not a requirement for you to use, but it is fantastic. And I'd love it if everyone made assessment and referrals for intimate partner violence and sexual violence standard. And maybe there's something about this practice that you'll find helpful. So the acronym to this intervention is called CUES, reviewing the limits of confidentiality, providing universal education, and empowerment by giving each patient 2 cards, as well as support by addressing any related health issues and offering supported referrals and pointing out the resources on the back of this card. Next slide. So confidentiality means disclosing the limits of your confidentiality. So healthcare providers, that would sound something like, I want you to know that everything you say here today is confidential unless you tell me you're thinking about hurting yourself or someone else if the person is over 18, or for someone who's under 18, I want you to know that everything you say here is confidential unless you tell me someone's hurting you physically or sexually, or you're thinking about hurting yourself or someone else. And then you normalize this activity. I've started to give 2 of these cards to all of my patients in case this is ever an issue for you, because relationships can change, and also for you to have the info so you can help a friend or family member if it's an issue for them. We know a lot of people have trouble with their relationships. So you make the connections between health and the relationship. It talks about healthy and safe relationships, ones that aren't, and how they can affect you. You can ask yourself questions. Does Like, does my partner support my using birth control that's best for me? And does my partner mess with my birth control or try to get me pregnant when I don't want to be? So then you give the patient 2 cards and you talk to them about the support. On the back of the card, there's a safety plan and 24/7 hotline that have folks who really understand complicated relationships. You can also make the warm referrals, and you also can put a note in the charts and follow up with them at the next visit. Next slide. It's really important to note that confidentiality is key to success with this intervention. In our partner sites, they've posted signs that say, in this clinic, we respect our patients' right to privacy and always see patients alone for a portion of their visit. We've included a link here called We Always See Patients Alone, but Dolly, I think we should go ahead and skip that for now, just because I'm watching the time and a little concerned about that. This is a great video from Futures Without Violence. Providers should only discuss intimate partner violence when the patient's alone, without parents, partners, friends, or children present. If this can't be done, it may be best to postpone the assessment for a follow-up visit. Next slide. So how does an intervention for reproductive coercion look different than an assessment for intimate partner violence? Dolly's going to unmute the line so that audience members can share their answers. You can also type in the chat box. How does an intervention for coercion look different?
If you would like to respond, if you could raise your hand, and then I will unmute you.
So the assessment for IPV is a lot of times like, do you feel safe? Does your partner hit, kick, slap you, or threaten you with harm? Those are some questions that I've heard at a lot of clinics. That's an assessment for intimate partner violence. How would an intervention for reproductive coercion be different than simply asking those assessment questions? Have you seen any responses, Dolly?
Looks like we've got a quiet group today.
Okay, I'll give you the answer then. And it is a bit of a tricky question, intentionally so. When it comes to reproductive coercion, you, the healthcare provider, is your key to the intervention. This is done by having a conversation and offering harm reduction strategies. Providers have to talk about intimate partner violence in order to assess the types of reproductive care that would work best for the patient. Talking about reproductive coercion can open the door to talking about relationship health and violence, and it can give your client, your patient, a window into a part of her life that she didn't realize she could control. Ask patients questions like, does your partner know when you'll have your period? Or do you have any concerns that your partner is monitoring your period? To get a better idea of what harm reduction strategies you can offer. So let's talk about specific harm reduction strategies. Oh.
Sorry, my bad.
Yeah. So remember that the goal is to enhance the patient's safety, and she may not want to or may not be able to leave her relationship. So these harm reduction approaches are for risk reduction, to reduce the risk of unintended pregnancies or untreated STIs. And while they're not a solution to an intimate partner violence relationship, they are approaches that reduce her risk. So talk about birth control that their partner doesn't have to know about, like the long-acting reversible contraception options like IUDs, Implanon. Give them backup emergency contraception if they're not interested in getting the LARC option, or have a wait period between when you're talking to them and when they can obtain the LARC. Do regular STI testing with them, and practice an STI partner notification in clinic versus at home. So the MA or the RN in the clinic would call the partner and say, we're calling you to report that someone reported you as a partner and they tested positive for chlamydia or gonorrhea, rather than telling the woman, okay, you're positive, so your partner's probably positive, so go tell him. Because oftentimes infidelity is used as another tactic of manipulation, and the woman may not have been unfaithful, but coming back and saying, like, I tested positive, so are you, so you're probably positive, is an opportunity for the partner choosing abusive behaviors to blame that on her and to harm her as a result. Again, another harm reduction strategy in terms of avoiding that assaultive behavior that I mentioned earlier, where sometimes partners have pulled out IUDs by the string, is to offer to cut the strings so that partners can't feel those. And while that makes it more challenging from a medical perspective in terms of removal, it is a harm reduction strategy for people who are at risk for that kind of assaultive behavior and the unintended pregnancies that could come with not having the long-acting reversible contraception. Next slide. So if a patient discloses experiencing violence, it's so important that we not make statements that are victim blaming, judgmental, or otherwise unnecessary for provision of services in the health clinic. It takes a lot of courage for a patient to reach out to someone regarding intimate partner violence. So the last thing we want to do is be judgmental. And as I'm sure you know, a lot of that comes down to checking our own biases and assumptions. It's not our place as service providers to define another person's experience. You know, you should call the police is not very helpful, especially when we talk about trauma, cultural, intergenerational trauma. Some communities don't think that the police are protecting their safety. You're definitely in an abusive relationship would be us as service providers defining someone else's experience, and that may not be welcome or warranted and could create barriers to them coming back for services later. That doesn't sound like rape to me. It's not really our judgment call, right? Does it sound like coercion? Does it sound like this person is feeling concerned that they don't have the right to control their own body or equal say in how sex is happening in their lives? Your partner's crazy, you need to break up with them. That disregards the love factor that we talked about earlier in the webinar. So it's unhelpful to label their partner in any way, even if you think that's the case, and it might seem like the case, right? But saying it out loud to a person who needs services from you is not helpful. Getting into the weeds and asking about details, what happened after that, and what happened after that, and what happened after that, is unnecessary. It's so important that providers stick to what information do you need to know in order to provide the services that the patient is seeking today, and what did you do to set them off? The ultimate victim blaming statement, right? That's not really important for why she's here seeking reproductive health services. So when services providers across the board, not just medical providers, respond to disclosures in the ways listed on this slide, we can become complicit in isolating survivors, because survivors may opt not to return for further health services if it means having to deal with other people's judgments about their situation. So what can we say instead? There aren't really any perfect answers. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Dolly. There aren't any perfect answers, but our goal is to respond compassionately and without judgment. So saying things like, I'm really glad you told me about this. I'm really sorry this is happening to you. No one deserves to be treated this way. You're not alone is really helpful, because I have not met a survivor of intimate partner or sexual violence who did not feel isolated and at fault for what happened to them. Help is available is a great statement. If you have the cards on hand, you can flip them over and talk about the lines there. And if you know resources in your area, which I'll talk about, you can refer them to those resources. A really solid response is, I'm glad you told me about this, and I'm concerned for your safety. So let's talk about ways that we can work with what's happening in your life to improve your safety. Your recognition and validation of the situation are invaluable. In fact, studies have found that the #1 way to mitigate trauma in survivors of any kind of trauma is that when the survivor talks about what happened, the person who's receiving that information listens to them and believes them. Next slide. So there are many screening tools, but the Futures Without Violence screening tool has been studied in family planning settings, and it's been found to lead to a 71% reduction in the odds for pregnancy coercion compared to the control group. And women receiving the intervention were 60% more likely to end a relationship because it felt unhealthy or unsafe. Again, not because they were pressured or told they should leave, but because they identified their relationships as unhealthy and unsafe and decided they needed to do something different. They weren't going to stay with that partner. And this card also provides information on warm referrals, connecting to local programs, as well as connecting to the National Domestic Violence Hotline. So you as service providers can say, you know, if you'd like, I can put you on the phone right now with a local advocate, and they can help you come up with a plan to protect your safety. Advocacy services are complementary and distinct from other on-site behavioral health referrals for a variety of reasons. So let's go to the next poll. Can any of you on the line tell me, what do advocates do? And I'm talking about advocates specifically focused on survivors of intimate partner and sexual violence. How would the services be complementary and distinct? What do we do?
This is a word cloud.
And again, I'm asking you this because during a 4-year partnership, there was kind of continual levels of confusion with different provider groups about, you know, what does an advocate do anyway? So it's really important that we talk about this. What do survivor advocates do? They support survivors. They educate survivors. They offer resources. I am employed at the Resource Center. It's true. We do offer resources. Yeah. Okay. So support, education, resources. Yeah, those are some of the things that we do. Advocates are specifically trained in tactics and dynamics of intimate partner and sexual violence and safety planning for survivors who are experiencing intimate partner or sexual violence. Our confidentiality policy is different than the HIPAA confidentiality policy and more stringent. And the reason for that is because we want to provide survivors a place that they can go where they can talk about the full extent of what they're experiencing without having the concern of mandated reporting that would be the norm in almost any other social area where they would be seeking services. Yeah. So let's go to the next slide, Dolly. Offer support, education, resources. This graph is from our Safer Futures project evaluation in Tillamook. The advocate tracking tool that you see results here from was developed in partnership with our leadership team in Tillamook and the Portland State University LCSW school to help advocates track everything they do with clients in order to help providers get a sense of what they do with patients who are referred to advocates. So emotional support can be further broken down. You'll see that that's the #1 service provided, can be further broken down as destigmatizing experiences of intimate partner and sexual violence and normalizing trauma responses across a spectrum for having experienced intimate partner and sexual violence. For our advocate who was working specifically in healthcare settings, the next service she provided most often was additional medical and behavioral health referrals. So plugging that person back into systems that could help with different components of her situation. And then safety planning. So safety planning, over 6 months, this advocate saw 64 unique clients and she had 374 contacts with those 64 individuals. In those 374 contacts, she did safety planning with the clients over 300 times. So this is a primary component of what we do, safety planning for harm reduction, whatever the situation is. It has to change with the changing circumstances of the survivor. We offered education on trauma-related skill building and support to get through things like interviews at DHS to get DV funding that are not very trauma-informed processes because people have to tell a lot about the traumatic events of their story. We helped connect them with food security and economic stability through programs like WIC and SNAP, food bank resources, hot meal sites, etc. Provided legal advocacy by connecting them to legal services. We are not lawyers, we do not provide legal services, but we can help with filling out civil legal paperwork like temporary restraining orders, stalking orders, and sexual assault protection orders. We provided education on the health effects of intimate partner violence, health advocacy. And what's really cool, and the feedback we got from a lot of our partners was saying like, oh, we thought that you guys did like a lot of safe housing and sheltering people in your shelter situations, right? But what's great about this is it shows that safe housing and shelter is one of our least common services. And it's really important when it needs to happen. But you can refer people to us well before a person saying like, I need to get out, I need to leave. Because again, we want to think about that kind of public health view of intimate partner violence. So now that I talked about all these advocacy interventions, and you're not all located in Tillamook, Oregon, so you can't refer people directly to my fantastic colleagues at the Resource Center, where can you refer people? I've included this slide because it has a link to the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, which maintains a list of advocacy organizations across the state. You can search by location, by the language that the patient speaks, or by the types of services that you're looking for. And so types of services are really intimate partner violence, and some centers are sexual assault specific centers, depending on what a person's experiencing. And I've also included a link to the Sexual Violence Resource Mapping Project. And Dolly, do you have that pulled up on the screen? The Oregon Health Authority and Oregon Department of Education teamed up to introduce the Oregon Sexual Violence Prevention Resource Map. It displays information to promote skills-based learning to prevent sexual violence. So this MAPS tool is part of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention grant to help its partner organizations prevent injuries such as sexual violence. And according to data obtained by the Oregon Healthy Teen Survey, 1 in 8 students, 1 in 5 female students, and 1 in 5 youth who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender reported that they were pressured to engage in unwanted sexual activity. So there's a lot of resources on this website. And one of the things most often cited is that healthy relationship education is key to preventing teen dating violence and sexual violence. And this is where healthcare providers can be part of this prevention and the resource mapping to offer education on what are healthy relationship dynamics and what are unhealthy relationship dynamics. So I wanted to show you this tool, and you can go back and spend some time checking it out and looking at your area. It also talks about regional specific supports. So you can check out services in your area for these various community-based survivor advocacy organizations. Thanks, Dolly. So how do we define success? We want to create safe environments for disclosures. So we want to see patients alone for a portion of their visit in order to offer them supportive messaging and educate them about the health effects of violence. It's so important for healthcare providers to make the connection between unhealthy relationships and reproductive health impacts. You know, we're not talking about people's relationships because we're being nosy. We're talking to them because this can have direct impacts on their reproductive health as well as their general health. And it's important to share birth control options that can be more hidden, that can be harm reduction strategies like we talked about. Offer strategies to promote safety, such as connecting with an advocacy program. A lot of times advocacy programs offer things like support groups. For example, our healthcare providers are referring, the majority of the referrals are to our support groups, and we offer an art therapy focused on resilience building support group once a week. So healthcare providers in our area know these things and refer to our centers. Those are strategies to promote safety even while people are experiencing ongoing abuse, because it connects them to resources and gives them tools to increase their safety, security, their self-esteem, and their self-efficacy are improved by participating in these kinds of programs. So inform yourselves about your community resources, because these may be happening in a center near you. Make warm referrals, get to know the advocacy programs for you. We do cross-training with our public health and the Tillamook County Community Health Centers. So they come and train our advocates on current forms of birth control, how they're used, and we have discussions about, you know, how they could be sabotaged and what we can do as advocates to talk to people coming through our door, and how we can get them into the clinic as quickly as possible when we know that they're experiencing safety issues and violence. So this is a cross systems referral. So you can train the advocacy programs and allow the advocacy programs to come in and talk to you. I also do annual trainings on intimate partner violence, human trafficking, and trauma-informed mandated reporting with our health clinic. So those are the options for defining success. And I just want to thank you all for your participation today. And I'll be here for a few moments if you have any questions as we close out the webinar.
Thank you, Emily. That was a fabulous webinar. We literally have 1 minute left. So if anyone has a question, you can enter it in the chat box. We have recorded today's webinar, and it will be available on the RH webpage sometime next week. I'm not going to tell you which day. I'll just say next week. And we'll make sure to send it out via email so that you can share it with other providers in your clinics. Emily, thank you so much for this information. We really appreciate it.
Yeah,
I don't see any other questions coming through.
Feel free to email me if you have questions after you've taken a break from this information.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Have a fabulous Thursday. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you for your work.
Take care.
Bye-bye.